Continuing on the theme, and I think all the following speakers are going to be on similar themes of looking at big picture and what we need to do, is Krystal Wrigley. Krystal is a fuels technology chief at ExxonMobil's Technology Center in Clinton, New Jersey. She spent a 16-year career as a chemical engineer for the company, beginning as a researcher and then advancing into her present role as leader in technology strategy and product development implementation. Krystal?
Good afternoon. I was joking with Ray, I'm a little bit shorter, so hopefully y'all can see my face as I present. As Ray mentioned, I am the Chief Base Stocks, Fuels, and Intermediates Product Engineer with ExxonMobil Technology and Engineering Company. My title just changed September 1st, so it's expanded a bit beyond just fuels. What I do is really look at what is our technology and capability strategy to help advance product solutions into the market. That goes all the way from manufacturing through to differentiating our products in the market, all the way to ensuring that they're delivered to our customers reliably and with high quality. Another aspect of my job is to actually look at the future and try to understand, for example, in transportation, how will the energy needs of the transport sector evolve over time, and how will that impact demand? And so my team will work with OEMs, similar to Subaru up here earlier, to think through, is it hydrogen, is it electricity, is it low emission fuels, and how will that manifest? And that ends up getting funneled into what we call the ExxonMobil Global Outlook. We produce the Global Outlook pretty much over the last several decades, and it provides us insight into what are the supply and demand that's going to move forward for the energy sector. And this year, we've released our view out to 2050. We use the Outlook for a number of different purposes. One is business planning. So energy is a long-term energy market, right? So we need to understand how will supply and demand evolve over the next several decades in order to inform our capital investment strategy. So this is critical to what we do as a business moving forward. The other aspect of the outlook, which is really important, is looking at economic prosperity, how that influences energy needs into the future, and how that will grow energy demand potentially, but also how that contributes to emissions. So you really need to look at both, right? Energy requirement as well as emissions impact of that energy. And then finally, I think I wanted to share that this global outlook is available publicly. And so you can go, you'll see at the end of my presentation, there'll be a QR code. You can actually go to the link, and it'll have a lot more detail in terms of how we look at the global energy market and how we see energy supply and demand moving forward. So please feel free to see more of those materials. Also, I think it's really great to be given this opportunity. I really appreciate NJBIA allowing us to come and speak, because honestly, the benefit of this outlook is to share it publicly so that it can help inform how policy can help support economics, the environmental sustainability, as well as the emissions requirements of the future. So hopefully that opens up a discussion and adds some clarity to our view. Okay, so first I wanted to start with our key 2050 takeaways. And you'll see a consistent trend where the world is going to have more people. More people will enjoy more economic prosperity, and that directly links into their energy needs and energy with lower emissions, but not quite low enough. And so if we start, we have about 8 billion people in the world today. Our outlook shows that there will be a growth of about 2 billion, so up to 10 billion out to 2050. This will lead to a doubling of the global economy. So as I mentioned, as that economy grows, that also means energy is required. So we see that that energy increase will be about 15% through 2050. And this is predominantly going to be driven by growing population with rising living standards. And that's going to be in many of the people that live in developing nations. And I'll show some data. I'm an engineer, by the way, I'm a chemical engineer, so I like data. So I'm going to show you data that supports all of these points. So how are we going to meet that growing energy demand? There's a number of solutions that are required, renewable energy being one of them. And the biggest area that we see growth is actually in wind and solar. We had some discussions on that earlier today. So we see a 5-fold increase in wind and solar energy, predominantly going into the power generation sector. Other solutions are also required. So there's not just one silver bullet. We'll need solutions from biofuels, from hydrogen. I'll talk a little bit about carbon capture and sequestration, hydropower, geothermal, for example. Even with all of those options, we still see, just due to the magnitude of energy demanded by the world, that 54% of the world's energy will still need to be met by oil and gas. So that's why we're going to talk about an and equation. So with that, if you take all of that look out in the projection and the outlook, we see that that will result in about a 25% decline in emissions by 2050. So that's significant progress, 15% increase in energy, but 25% decline in emissions. But it's not quite enough to limit warming below the 2 degrees C Paris Agreement target. Now, as ExxonMobil looks at where can we contribute to this equation, we are focused in the 50% of society's emissions that come from industrial and commercial transportation sectors. And that's where our low carbon solutions business, which we formed just a few years ago, is focused in carbon capture and sequestration, hydrogen, and lower emission fuels as viable solutions. They're generally hard to decarbonize, so that allows us to bring capability to bear. And then finally, if we want to accelerate the rate and pace of the energy transition, it's really going to require 3 different things. We need policy that's resilient and that catalyzes solutions into the market that are not economic today. Second, we do need technology. This is my favorite. We need to innovate, and we need to bring scalable, lower-cost solutions to the table. And then finally, the only way this is sustainable is if the market picks it up and drives the penetration of those new energy, renewable energy into the market. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the data that supports those statements. So I mentioned global energy demand is going to grow by 15% out to 2050. As I mentioned, that growth is really going to be predominantly in the non-OECD countries. You can see this in the chart on the left-hand side, global energy demand. I'll just note the y-axis, it's quadrillion BTU. So just think quadrillion. It's a lot of energy. As we look across the last century, 2 centuries out to where we are today, you see that energy demand has grown very significantly. Between 2000 and 2010, that was about 27% growth. But as we move to 2010 to now, it's about 13%. And then as we move through 2040 into 2050, it's about a 3% growth. So while energy demand is rising, the rate and pace is starting to level off. Now, you also see 2 different trends here with regard to the OECD nations and the non-OECD. So non-OECD does grow over the period, all the way from now until 2050 by about 31%, whereas OECD is going to decline by about 11%. And why is that? It's not because we're not growing in population and we're not growing in prosperity. It's actually because we're really efficient. We're actually deploying the best technologies into the market that drives greater efficiency. So even though we're continuing to grow in economic prosperity, we can meet that need with less energy. That same thing is not necessarily true for non-OECD nations today. And so you can see on the right-hand side how the global energy growth is broken down by sector, where we see power generation generally has a fairly significant decrease in OECD, slight increase in the non-OECD. But the 2 areas, again, and this is where ExxonMobil is focused, is industrial and transportation. You see the decline in the OECD nations are a bit less, and the growth in the non-OECD is significant. So these are opportunities to bring affordable, reliable energy and also decarbonization solutions to the market. Okay, so I've painted the demand picture on a global basis. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we meet that demand. So the first thing you'll notice is the line on the top, which is green, is oil. It's still the primary energy source that we see in the outlook out to 2050. And again, that's because it's used primarily in that commercial and industrial sectors that I showed you on the last slide. We also see that natural gas is going to increase. We talked a little bit about coal decreasing. You see the same thing. I think, Bob, you mentioned this. Coal decreases over the outlook. We see that natural gas is going to be the predominant energy source that displaces coal in the power generation sector. But there's still a lot of opportunity for renewables. I mentioned solar and wind, which is the yellow line here. You see that that grows about 5 times out from today into 2050. Significant growth rate starts from a very small base. And so when you look at its overall contribution, really important, it's starting to make huge inroads, but it doesn't displace the need for natural gas, for example, in power generation. Other renewables, which is the purple line, this includes things like biofuels, like hydropower, geothermal, et cetera. So we do see steady increase of that energy requirement moving forward. And then finally, nuclear. On a global basis, we do see nuclear increasing, although at a relatively lower rate. So I mentioned that ExxonMobil is particularly focused in the areas where we see energy demand continuing to be a large growth area, but also where they're hard to decarbonize. And our definition of hard to decarbonize is essentially it's hard to electrify. So we had a bit of a discussion on light-duty passenger vehicles. Generally we think that's an easier to electrify segment. And so that will impact and be the predominant energy source for the light-duty vehicle market. However, the same can't necessarily be said for commercial transportation or industrial. So we see that there's really 3 key technology opportunities for us and also for the world to help decarbonization solutions move forward. First is carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and sequestration. That's shown on the bar chart on the left. Here you see that the need to mitigate emissions through capture and sequestration grows significantly in industrial and electricity generation sector. If you're not familiar with CCS, it's essentially you capture CO2 at the source and you sequester it into geological formations under the ground safely and reliably. So instead of emitting it into the air, you're sequestering it. That allows you to continue to use low-cost energy sources while still mitigating CO2 emissions. Another piece, we talked a little bit about green hydrogen earlier. We have something we call blue hydrogen. So blue hydrogen is where you can make hydrogen from methane, except you pair it with CCS, and then you can drive the carbon intensity of hydrogen down, and you can either combust it or use it in a fuel cell, and since there's no carbon in that molecule, you now aren't contributing to CO2 emissions at the source, or at the point of use. So hydrogen becomes a really significant opportunity as we look to the future. Predominantly moving from 2030 to 2050, we see the growth in industrial applications. This is where you need a lot of energy and high heat to make the products or uses for chemicals, for example. So hydrogen becomes a really good source of energy there. The other piece is transportation. As I mentioned, light duty, we're not so focused on hydrogen for light duty, but we do see that it has a great use case for heavy duty. And in particular in the US market, when you think about tractor trailers moving from east to west coast, long haul, they have high loads in the back of their truck, hydrogen becomes a more energy dense source to move and to have less refueling than a battery electric. So battery certainly has a place, but as you look at harder to decarbonize or harder use cases, hydrogen may come in and actually be the primary energy source. And then finally, one thing we haven't talked about a lot today is biofuels. So think about the existing vehicle fleet. There are a lot of vehicles that still burn fossil fuels today. Biofuels give you the ability to decarbonize backwards. So if you can leverage the existing infrastructure and you can leverage the existing vehicle, biofuels give you a pathway to continue to decarbonize. And we actually have a number of investments already underway in the biofuel space. We're predominantly focused on diesel and aviation or marine fuels. And the reason is because of this. Essentially, you see on the right-hand side, aviation, think about it. Can you put a battery on an aircraft that's going to go from the US over to Europe? It's a heavy weight to have an airplane have to fly like that. So if you can provide sustainable aviation fuels, we call them SAF, that enables the aviation industry to also decarbonize their operations. So again, you need a multi-pronged solution because there's not just one that works for everything. And that's why we also support technology neutral policy that helps bring these solutions to market without picking and choosing winners, because we need a diversity of options and solutions. And then I talked global, and actually, Bob, I think this view is very similar to what you shared, so I won't spend a ton of time. I did obviously want to connect back to the United States and what that means for us. And you can see from the ExxonMobil viewpoint, the US is going to trend similar to the other OECD nations, where efficiency is going to drive reduction in overall energy required. And you see a lot of that reduction is actually happening in transportation. Light duty in particular, where electrification is going to move in and start to reduce the need of liquid fuels. However, if you look at the right-hand side, energy is declining, but the percent of oil and natural gas required to still meet that energy demand, remains at about 70%. So it's at 70% today. We see it'll be about 70% in the future, although at a lower total level. You also see that renewables do increase, and they're starting to make up a significant portion of that demand. It's about 25%, including nuclear. So very much, we're seeing the transition start. However, that's why we really say you need an end solution, because renewables, while incredibly important to decarbonization moving forward, access to energy that's affordable and reliable is also incredibly important. And so we see that we need to provide the energy and products the world needs and reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. And we're looking to bring solutions to the forefront in order to enable that. And then I think just I'm just going to reconnect back to where I started. So how do we help to accelerate the rate and pace of the transition? One, we need public policy support. Clear and consistent policy to incentivize lower emission solutions. Also, as we look to the future, permitting. Permitting can actually be the inhibitor of the rate and pace of things like carbon capture and sequestration or hydrogen deployment. So permitting is really important to try to find ways that we can move that forward faster. Technology is also really important. We need innovative solutions. We need an all-of-the-above technology strategy to drive costs down. And we need to invest in research and development with government, universities, and companies in order to bring these solutions to bear. And then finally, market-driven. We need to develop an economy that values and pays for emission reduction on a life cycle basis. So that means all the way from well to wheels. And we also need transparent price on carbon to incentivize consumer behavior and spur the carbon markets. So that's what I'll leave you with today. As I mentioned, here is the QR code. If you are interested in learning more about the global outlook, you can go here. We'll also send this out with the presentation after the conference. And I'll close out and say thank you very much. Appreciate the time.